I think the maintenance issue is what really that comes down to. If you have an EMR and an instrument tracking solution or a paper solution, and those don't talk to each other, then the EMR doesn't know what you have available, and you have to manually build it here and manually build it here, right? So getting to a single source of truth can be really beneficial so that your maintenance happens in one location and then it slides across, and you can control that through the setup of those interfaces.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
What's going on, Clean Freaks? You're listening to Season 27 of the Beyond Clean podcast. I'm Bobby Parker, and joining me in studio is the one and only Weston Hank Balch. Welcome back to the studio, Hank.
Hank the Tank. Hank that tank.
That's right.
Here, Bob.
On today's episode, we're going to be looking at general surgery. Everybody's probably very first service line that they learned in sterile processing as they were training, looking at those hemostats and retractors, but taking a more specific look at general surgery, what kinds of things these trays are used for, but more than that, how can we optimize their use in the OR? So buckle up. It's going to be probably one of our longer episodes, but we're going to move through it fast because there's a lot of ground to cover. So we'll be right back.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Clean Freaks, we are in studio now with two fantastic guests talking about this general service line conversation. So many implications and applications to this conversation. It's a really unique episode too in this season because this is one of those, even though we're focusing on that time within the room and the experience of that instrumentation in the operating room, this has tie-ins obviously throughout the entire workflow in sterile processing, the data, the planning, collaboration, you name it, but you're not tuning in to hear me talk. Let's get to our guests. So joining us today are Kyle Louie, the Senior Strategic Sales Executive at Aesculap, as well as Craig Stevens, the IHT Manager at a health system in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome you both to the show today.
Thank you, Hank.
Thanks, Hank. Happy to be here again.
So before we jump into the topic at hand, even though we got your titles out there, I would like to share a little bit of background about you guys. I'll let you guys do that too, just so folks can orient. What's your perspective? Where are you speaking from? What have you seen out there in the industry to date? Let's start maybe with you, Craig. What's your background?
Yeah, thanks, Hank. So my name is Craig Stevens. I'm the IHT manager for our organization, and I have been here for quite some time. I started off as a nurse, working in the OR since 2011, and just have had a lot of opportunities throughout our organization in different roles within the OR, and now I'm fortunate to manage the IHT team that supports all of surgical services.
And when you say IHT, what does that mean?
Yeah. Integrated Health Technologies. It's okay. IT, but in healthcare.
Even fancier. Okay. Love it. Welcome, Craig. What about you, Kyle? So if anyone's been tuning in to Beyond Clean for a couple of years now, they may recognize your name, your face. You've been on a string of videos. I think we talked about big data in that data series a little while ago. But for anybody who's not familiar, who are you?
Yeah, that was super fun, Hank. I am a senior strategic sales executive with Asculap. My primary responsibilities are deployment and management of our automated perioperative solutions out into the US market. We've done a lot in terms of trying to help break the glass ceiling around sterile processing and really help healthcare systems understand, both from the clinical and financial aspect, how important proper investment and balancing of that department is. So we have a lot of cool tools, programs, and services that allow hospitals to do that in varying degrees of capacity. So, I'm primarily responsible for that.
I think you said perioperative automation. Is that the phrase you used?
Yeah, it's a good one, huh? Never said that before.
Just give me a practical example of the kinds of things you do just to orient again.
Yeah, absolutely. So for things like production management systems, what we consider to be the evolution of tracking systems, from proper integration of sterile processing software to the electronic medical record, the Epics of the world, making sure preference cards are accurate, reducing the amount of bloat in trays, establishing baseline assessments for helping facilities understand resource requirements by procedure type to get productivity dialed in. We have some pretty powerful machine learning engines that can be deployed in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, great. It sounds like I got the right two guys to talk about this conversation today.
That's because Craig is here.
Well, that's right. I got the right one guy, and then he brought a tag team with him.
That's me. Yeah, I'm just a sidekick. I'm Robin.
All right. So let's get to it here. Oh, yeah, MASH. I used to love that show. Let's get to the topic at hand. We are talking about the general service line. So I've had a couple of surgeries in my life. I had ear surgeries when I was a kid, and then I had the classic appendectomy. So right down the middle of this general service line. But what are some of those other procedures, Craig? Like when we say general, what's involved in the category of the kinds of procedures that we would be doing with those trays?
Yeah, totally. So generally, the general service line can do a lot of the things, and they overlap with a lot of different areas within the health system and the hospital. So it can depend on where you're located, right? So a general surgeon at a large hospital with multiple service lines at it might be a very fine intra-abdominal space kind of surgery, right? But when you look at maybe a critical access hospital, that could be different. So the things that you might see, the appendectomy, like you called out, or like a cholecystectomy where we remove the gallbladder, are common. We do a lot of exploratory cases where somebody comes in with generalized abdominal pain and we're not so certain where that's coming from. We might do that. We do a fair amount of maybe rectal or colon resections or areas around there. And it can vary widely, like I said, from provider to provider, whether that's laparoscopic, robotic, or fully open. And it kind of has a broad kind of measure for what they're capable of.
Yeah. So, Greg, that is the perfect segue into this episode, because one of the reasons that I chose the general service line, it doesn't get a lot of love the way that maybe some of the other service lines do when we're talking about optimization and tray builds and everything else, because people want to focus on orthopedics, they want to focus on neuro, there's all these other ones to look at. And yet it can be a type of a workhorse, Kyle, to Craig's point. But the complexities, and this is the segue piece, right? He's saying, hey, it kind of depends on where you are, the type of facility, what kind of procedures your surgeons are doing for how your general trays are going to look. So how do you start here? This is what the whole conversation is going to be, right? But How do you begin in the context of these complexities to even say, is there such a thing as a standard general service line tray setup, and how do we even get there?
Yeah, great framing. And I think the way that Craig brought this into perspective is perfect. In just the examples that you've given and Craig's given about types of general procedures, right? We walked all the way, cephalad to caudad, up and down the anatomy. So we're not in one specialized location. We are all over the place, which I think is kind of the reason why general surgery is, really consistently utilized in specialties outside of general surgery. And I think that's where, when we start talking about, the conversation around sterile processing, which my brain immediately goes to like instrument management and like proper like count sheet compliance and things like that. We are inevitably using these trays across specialties, which creates a very unique and significant like logistical challenge when attempting to streamline these trays. So when we start talking about proper tray setup or count sheet development, when Craig and I met on this yesterday, we started to, answer the prompts, and we immediately got to the point where at the core of general surgery, especially in light of this like rapid OR growth with these really high turn resource intensive specialties, we're really interested today in this conversation because, we want to talk about some of the ways that data can assist in automating the alignment of inventory with this like dynamic clinical need. So I think it's a really cool place to be, but without the proper systems or maybe like foresight in place, hospitals get crushed by these general surgery trays. We were in a facility last week doing some tray optimization stuff, and they had a major set that was almost 200 instruments.
Holy cow.
Yeah, the thing weighed like almost 30 pounds. Yeah. And of course that's not compliant, just from Amy, right? But how do you find what you're looking for in that thing?
Yeah, and from a workflow perspective, all the reprocessing, that's wild. So, Kyle, you mentioned using data to assist with that. What about if you were OR director on day one and starting from scratch? Is there data that you'd be pulling from like hospitals, or do you meet with surgeons and build out those instruments from the beginning and then trend what's getting used and not used and optimize from there? Or is there a way where we can make smarter decisions even from day one about building our general service trays?
Cool question, Bobby. I'm going to open up a whole can of worms with this one, and I'm really excited to hear what Craig has to say about this because I know he's got firsthand experience here. So as a new peri-op director, day one, the data that I would harvest is the tribal knowledge of my team leads who are dealing with those sets every single day. There's a really big difference between what's actually used in these specific types of procedures and what's documented of what belongs in the set. And I think that tray title with, 200 instruments, 30-pound general tray is a great example of that, right? That tray didn't start at 200 instruments. It grew over time because that nurse remembers that one time 20 years ago, we had to have this item and the preference cards doesn't have the ability to have singles on it. So canvassing and having a good vehicle to capture that tribal knowledge of staff members and then manage that data and information stream over time, I think is critical right now because it's healthcare, right? There's a huge people component to it that a lot of these modern systems don't really take into account. They try and eliminate that. And that's such a huge cultural jump, I think, that it kind of does a disservice to what, working in healthcare is.
For sure. And Kyle, you teased that Craig may have a story around this topic. So let's let it out of the bag.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. Kyle, you hit on an exact point there that is super challenging when it comes to ORs. And the general tray becomes the catch-all tray, right? This is the tray that we go to when no other tray can hold this because it's at weight. So we're trying to find a place to put it. So we're going to go put this in our major tray or our fund tray or our general minor tray so that we can pull it into this case. And what we see then, especially on my side where we're building these systems out for people to be able to add them to preference cards like you mentioned, you may run into a circumstance where we have a tray on a case because of one instrument in that tray, and we don't have a way for that one instrument to be available in our EMR for them to put on the preference card because of limitations, right? And lack of automations. And with some of the tools that are coming out and that are available now, we can start to do some integrations and we can build this into the EMR so that instruments come from a single source of truth and then are loaded into the system. And we have prime examples. We recently just looked at a situation where there were 16 trays pulled in for a single procedure, and the amount of effort to just pick that alone. They took 2 case carts, and this procedure was not even like complex or multi-provider, where they're pivoting and moving. None of that. It was a relatively straightforward procedure with a couple different case codes on it that was pulling in a lot of instrumentation, and nobody really knew which one we needed to have on there. And we did some breakdown analysis with the team to talk through, with the tools that we have, can we find a way to eliminate some of these trays? Because what are you using from this tray that we need, and can we put it somewhere else? And this is where that coordination with SPD, OR, leads in the departments, surgeons even, and when you talk about a new facility, like leaning in with all of those things, right? Like talking to a representative when it comes to standardized instrument trays is a way of starting, right? Saying, do you have a list that normally you put in a general tray? That helps us get a starting point. Then I can meet with my surgeon and say, is this going to meet your needs, or do we need something different? And then I can talk to my lead CSDs or my SPD staff and say, what have you seen at other facilities? Do you have other feedback? And we bring all of that together and coalesce that in. And then going forward from there, we start to run some data points, right? Of what else are they pulling into cases and what else are they using? And we start to bring that data all together. And that's one of the huge, really fun for me, like pieces of this, is being able to start to bring those data elements and bring it all together into one story.
So both of you guys kind of alluded to this, and I want to clarify if I'm understanding what you're saying or if this is kind of past tense. Are you saying that current EMRs today on the market, depending on which one, may not let you put singles on a preference card?
So current EMRs, you are able to build out as many instruments as you want to add to a preference card that I'm aware of the major EMRs that are out there. So I think the maintenance issue is what really that comes down to. If you have an EMR and an instrument tracking solution or a paper solution, then and those don't talk to each other, then the EMR doesn't know what you have available, and you have to manually build it here and manually build it here, right? So getting to a single source of truth can be really beneficial so that your maintenance happens in one location and then it slides across, and you can control that through the setup of those interfaces.
So before we move on, I want to go back to, I think the question might have went to you first, Kyle, and I thought your answer was interesting.
Uh-oh.
You said the first thing, you said the first thing you would do if you had like a day one launch as perioperative director is you would access the tribal knowledge. And I was really surprised that you said that. Kind of, knowing that, both you guys are data guys, I would have assumed I'm going to be pulling this data set. I got all this data library. Like I'm going to bring your data in. And then Craig brought it up the same thing. He said, I would be talking to my surgeons. I would talk to SPD, see, what have you guys seen? So is tribal knowledge good or bad in the scenario of building trays? And if it's good or bad, at what point in the process? Because I think Craig kind of nuanced it a little bit. Like where in the process we access tribal knowledge and how we balance that. But yeah, Kyle, can you speak to that? And Craig, if you got an opinion on that too.
Totally. I guess there's a couple nuances there, and I'm making a few assumptions here. So the first, which is not an assumption and is a fact, is I am not a provider. Craig is not a provider, and I don't know what instrument we need at this part in the anatomy when we encounter this specific problem during this procedure type. I'm never going to know that. I got like 40 years of schooling that I need to do before I can figure that out, right? And I'm just not going to do that. So we have to trust our providers to know clinically the best tool for the job. And obviously that is a whole different set of problems, right? As technique changes and new equipment comes out and new science is coming out, every class of residents that comes out is going to have a different way of doing things, right? So that's the first challenge where we have to canvas people, right? Providers need to have limitations, right? We can't go out and buy every cool thing we saw at a conference just because it's because it's sexy, right?
Oh, yeah, party pooper.
we have to put limitations around that, especially with, the financial situation that a lot of hospitals find themselves in now, right? Which is, hey, we got to run ourselves as a profitable business. But I have no idea where my expenditures are coming from because I'm trusting a very small subset of people that I cannot argue with that this $50,000 capital expense every month is necessary. So that's the one aspect of it, to contract compliance, but also give your doctors leeway. The second component of this, which is now where I'm making the assumption that I promised you, is that in order for us to pull data and have it be effective, we have to have access to a good data set. And when it comes to tracking systems, is that data accurate? We met with a health system talking about almost this exact problem a couple months ago, and they were using a older tracking system, and their solution around multiple manufacturers' items for the same pattern. So, for example, like a Aesculap cryo is one record, and a Mueller cryo is another record, and a Codman cryo is a third record. In order for them to easily determine where our current contract was in terms of like, this is where the best pricing is, and this is, per our GPO terms, what we have to buy, they would put 3 Z's and a dot in front of the name of the cryo. So it was, I don't think it was, I forget who their manufacturer was, but it was, cryo 5.5-inch curved, and then the prefix was ZZZ dot, dot, dot. And that way, when they went to search to put items into new count sheets, they would not search for cryo. They would search for ZZZ dot, dot, dot. And the system would pop up, hey,
God
here
bless
are
that creativity.
Workarounds.
People are creative, if nothing else, right? But as a new peri-op director, if I don't have the codex, so Nicolas Cage can guide me to this national treasure of data, like, how the heck am I supposed to figure that out, right? Like, that's insane. And this is what people are having to deal with because of these older systems that are not designed to automate this component. So I would love to be able to show up day one and say, all right, great, show me usage data of instrumentation by pattern, by procedure type. I want to see what we're using and what we're not using, because I think, Bobby, you made this example earlier. If we have a procedure where 30 trays are used and come back to decon, we open that case cart and there's 5 instruments that got used out of each of those trays. That's infuriating as an SPD tech, because I got to reprocess all 30 of these trays, man. And so why did we even send these up if you're only going to use, 30 total instruments out of 30 trays worth of instruments in this case cart? And I mean, there's a cost to that, and it's not cheap, right? In terms of hospitals owning that cost. We got to store it. We got to reset it. We got to make sure we're, following proper procedure, and detergent is getting more and more expensive, man. So, I mean, I'd love to pull tracking system data, but why if it's not accurate?
Yeah, for sure.
And I just like to say, with the tribal knowledge component, tribal knowledge is great in a planning phase, right? Where you can sit down with people and talk to them about the situation that they're experiencing and what they want to bring to the table. When you don't want tribal knowledge is when you're in the middle of a case and you're trying to find something, right?
There you go.
When you're running around the core, or you're down in SPD and you're like scrambling. And I've been that nurse looking for that tray with a CST and a surgeon scrubbed in a case right now. And I don't know where to find this instrument because it's in a tray somewhere. And in a paper tracking system or a inferior instrument tracking solution, I can't search that quickly. And I don't know where to look. And there was a period where I was the overnight charge. I'm the only person not in a room at this point, right? And technically I should be in a room, but I'm the only person not in a room right now. And I have to find this instrument so that they can take care of this patient, and trying to avoid IUSS and trying to avoid and get there and be fast and don't run around. And it's a challenge that our teams are running into all over the place. And that's when you don't want tribal knowledge. You want systems in place that can quickly help you find something so that you can get that patient taken care of.
Sure. And a lot of times, Craig, it's those experiences of not having something that we really needed and kind of the scramble that come from it that create maybe some tribal knowledge that is confrontational to making optimization changes. Have you ever encountered that, where there's an instrument being held into a tray because one nurse is saying we needed it that one time, but it only happened once. It was 3 years ago, but it's going to stay in that tray in case we need it again. So balancing that data and tribal knowledge has always been a challenge.
And we combat that workaround, that emotional response frequently, right? We encounter this where staff have experienced this 1, 2, or 3 times and they got burned, right? And they don't want to get burned again. So they're saying, nope, this is the solution. This is the answer. And we have tools that can help us with that if we employ them and we use them correctly and well. And I think it's really hard, especially as you adopt a new solution that maybe is going to help you fix this problem, to get everybody on board, right? There's that standard kind of curve of acceptance that happens where, at the beginning, you're getting like 2.5% engagement because these are the people that love things new. And then it builds to that bell curve of like, okay, we're topping 50%. People are engaging and we're getting this going. And then you'll fall off to those people that always feel like they have to have 16 triple checks in the system and, multiple places where this could be documented so that it doesn't get missed from their one time that they got burned.
Sure. So help us make this a bit more concrete for folks as we're kind of imagining what it looks like to optimize a tray in the general service line, especially something that is as broad and general as like a major instrument tray where you've got multiple physicians using it, each with kind of their own approaches to procedures, multiple procedures. We can't make it so general that it works for every tray. So how do you, as surgeries get more specific, or maybe surgeons get more specific, how do you optimize those tray setups to be more useful? Is it surgeon specific trays? Is peel packs always the answer? What do you think is the best way forward?
Can I take a crack at this one, Craig?
Go for it, Kyle. Yeah, you've probably got a better answer than I do right off the top.
I don't know about that, but we've done this a lot. And what we've found is that if you can identify, and now this is where tribal knowledge is not good and we do need data, right? If we can identify what trays most commonly flow together by procedure type. So if I know every time I pull, I'm just making this up, every time I pull, my minor ortho tray, I pull Dr. Stevens' special set every single time. If I can quantify that based on procedure type that we're focusing on, we can really see the amount of overlap of instrumentation between two tray titles that always swim together. And there's a lot more of those in hospitals than people think. And this is, where tribal knowledge kind of fails, right? There's probably a scrub tech out there who really knows. And that's also who we found has the most accurate, up-to-date tribal knowledge is the scrub techs. So if you can, how many physicians look at the back table? That's not a dig at all. It's just they got something else to worry about. And that's what their team is supporting them there for, right? So if you can canvas the scrub techs, quantify their tribal knowledge of what is actually being used and how it's used, get them in a room around all the like trays that swim together by procedure type, and then bring doctors in some kind of workshop, we can really start to drive pretty high reduction metrics for those trays. Now, when we start talking about general, this is where it gets really complicated, right? Because instead of in a specialty set, when we're only looking at, one or two surgical teams, we're now looking at 15 surgical teams across different specialties. So the ability to quickly find peel packs or quickly have like supplementary trays without going overboard is a very delicate line. Is this answering your question, Bobby? I know this is not a simple question. It's not a simple answer.
Yeah, it's not fair, I suppose, for me to ask such a broad question that's very situation specific. I just know that when you go crazy with the supplementary trays, that having additional containers that have to be opened and washed, and more setups on the back table, and all of that creates challenges. But if you go the other direction and build your 200 instrument major tray, then that doesn't help when you're doing an open abdominal case and now you're counting 200 instruments on the back table and all the challenges that come along with that. So I think that makes sense. It sounds like if a facility were maybe starting on this journey of tray optimization, that general setups maybe are one that are prime for optimization, or would you say this is probably the harder bull to tackle? I don't even think that's a phrase, but
it is now, man.
It is now. So do you grab that bull by the horns, or do you go with something that's maybe a bit more specific, like an ortho service line or a cardiac service line, where maybe you're having a narrower scope of procedures? Where would you start?
Sure. I don't want to take up all the airtime, so Craig, I want you to weigh in here too, man. But this is my opinion. I think that tackling the general trays will, if successfully done, will yield the highest reduction metrics. So when we start talking about overall instrument throughput, right? The way I look at successful optimizations is, hey, how many instruments on a heat intensity score? Like, so, 1 being the simplest to reprocess and 5 being the hardest. How many high intensity instruments did we reduce, from the reprocessing cycle in this period of time, whether it's a quarter or 6 months or a year or whatever, right? Because that's the stuff right there that's going to directly impact sterile processing productivity. when we start talking about productivity being the number of instruments on a heat intensity score that we reprocess this year, plus all the other non-productive stuff that we do in sterile processing. So general has the biggest potential to make a serious impact. But what we often see is if hospitals try and tackle this on their own, without a third party or, a piece of software that can assist with this project, the specialty services, the very specific trays, are the only places they can go because they don't know what their trays are being used for outside of that specific specialty. So instead of, just saying, hey, I have this very specific, Dr. Bulch's special set, and he only uses it, for A-lifts in this, in this scenario. And it's easy to go, oh, hey, doctor, you have 4 cryos in here. Do you need 4? Like, can we just have 2? And he goes, yeah, whatever. I don't know. That's fine. Do whatever you want. And now, hey, great. We reduced 2 instruments out of that set, and it's a 20 instrument set. So that's 10% reduction. We're the best. Right. But we only use that set, 5 times a year. So we really only save sterile processing, if my math is right, 20 instruments annually. Right. So, Craig, what do you think about this, man?
Well, and I was just going to say, Kyle, that in that circumstance too, the win, you hit on it perfectly, but the win is so minuscule that the reason the doc is saying, whatever, yeah, it's fine, is because it's such a little impact to them even, right? If this was something that they did all the time, I bet they lean in and they're like, wait, hold on. Okay, so I'm going to be here and I'm doing this, right? The way that doctors think is very pattern based. And so they have to be in the pattern almost to understand the impact of what you're asking, right? But they also know that like this specialty tray somehow got 4 cryos in it, but my neuroset also has 16 cryos in it. So do I really need 4 in this one? No, it's fine. We'll figure it out. And I think to hit on something that you touched on briefly there, Bobby, was that one of the things that we run into is as you go through this process, I think it's really easy for me to bring in a neuro team and do the neuro workflow. I can do that independently with my leadership and my staff around the organization, and we can run through the neuro workflows. I think the thing to hit on is what trays are we bringing into their cases? And if you look at it and say, these are neuro trays, and then all of these are ortho and general trays. Why are we bringing these trays in? And then let's talk about what's here that you do or don't need. And then let's talk about, do we need peel packs or do we need specialty trays? And a great example for us was when we started down this path of SSI and really trying to focus on how do we reduce surgical site infections, we came up with needing a closing tray. And part of that's because we're going to open up a whole new table with just instruments that we're going to use to close after we've exited a certain space in the body cavity or area that we're working on. And those trays are really powerful, but maybe they start to leak into neuro, or maybe they start to leak into, and those are areas that we weren't necessarily incorporating that idea, and they were meant for general surgery. Are there ways that we can tailor that, or does it need to come around? And these questions are questions that really the CSTs, the scrub techs, have to answer for us with the providers, because we need input on what are you using in these trays for us to be able to answer. Is it a peel pack? Is it another tray? Is it what, or does it just go in a different tray so we don't have to open 30 trays? Maybe we can get away with 10.
If you're auditioning, Craig, to get brought back for an episode 2, you just passed your audition because I want to know more about that closing tray setup in the relation to SSI stuff. We don't have time, obviously, on today's episode, but really, really interesting concept in the context of, what we're talking about too with optimization that impacts quality. Like I know we've been talking about efficiency and production, but that's a real key approach, that's running parallel, obviously, but has different goals. As we move toward a close, we want to try to give some very practical advice to the audience today who particularly sterile processing. So all the things that we're talking about, oh yeah, totally. Like you get the surgeon's attention, you get the perioperative team, you get the scrub techs. That's great. If you get that buy-in, then you get the process. But what do we say to the sterile processing audience that's encountering these general trays that have 200 instruments that are 30 pounds and they're not getting traction yet? They haven't got the attention or the support from anybody outside of each other in SPD, where we look at and we're like, another one of these trays again. Like, what has been the key triggers that you guys have seen to be successful in getting this conversation forward. And again, like any kind of practical advice that you can give to the SPD leader or even the SPD technician that may be listening to this saying, oh man, we need this. I see the impact. I don't really know where to go from here. And Craig, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. This is really valuable, and it's super challenging, I think. And I've been in that shoe where we're trying to figure out, like, how do I get a resource, right? And when I was in charge of one of our surgery centers, you're a little blip, right? You're not even like close to the volume that a main OR does. And even some of the critical access hospitals are doing more volume than some of our surgery centers were doing at that time. And what does it look like to get somebody engaged? For me, that looked like bringing in a quality team member or an accreditation team member and saying, and we did environment of care surveys that are happening on a regular basis, and starting there and then getting through them a quality person or an infection prevention person to say, this doesn't meet the spec, right? Or we're doing this all the time, over and over and over and over for no reason, right? Like it's not actually getting anything from our perspective, and we'd love to understand the reason of that. And I think it starts there. You can escalate through surgical leadership as well. I think that if that's an option for you, that getting the surgery managers and directors and folks to understand that as well. Certainly, if you have a tray that's over the 25-pound limit, like there can come a point where it's like, we are
Joint commission will tell you that one.
This is a joint commission validation.
Yeah.
We are not going to process this tray, right? And so it surprises me when I see these, and we still see them occasionally. Even vendor sets that are coming in will not meet the requirement. We end up having to put them in a separate package because they've loaded, maybe the local vendor added some extra things to it, so now it has too much in it, right? So there's an opportunity for the staff to use their what we would call safety tools and speak up and say, this doesn't meet the standard, we can't do this, and escalate that to the appropriate leadership channels. And if your leader isn't doing that, your organization should allow you to share with your quality teams, even as a first year tech. If you're asking the questions because you're doing the test right now, you're probably one of the most knowledgeable on the team, not from a street smarts perspective, but from a perspective of I know because I'm reading the book right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Kyle, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that there isn't a cleaner way that sterile processing can just say, hey, I need this, and the hospital listens. Like, that's the way it should be, right? With how important SPD is to literally one half of that reprocessing cycle, right? Or I should say perioperative cycle. Without SPD, we got no instruments. And yet still we have to fight for validity to have a seat at the table to say, hey, I need something that is going to make it easier for me to turn around your instruments on time. So getting off my soapbox, the easiest way, or maybe I'll say the most consistent way I've seen these reduction initiatives get kicked off is when there's a correlation to delay in cases or late starts due to inventory-based issues. Because when we start talking about case delays, and I mean, we have a couple minutes and I said case delays, so like, let's do 8 more episodes, right?
Okay, you want another episode too, don't you, Kyle? Okay, case delay. We'll do you case delays with Craig, the closest.
As long as Craig is there, I'll be happy, man. There's a lot of money involved in that. And I think this is where the metrics start getting a little bit squirrely around like the actual costs that we're saving by reducing the number of instruments and sets. There's a lot of really great studies out there that kind of can prove, hey, it's this much per instrument, or it's this much time, or it's this much OR minute cost. But every hospital is so radically different. Unless they have an internal study that can prove, hey, this is what we believe our metric is in terms of cost per minute in the OR at this point in the case, that kind of starts to fall apart. But we know that there's a cost metric around delaying in cases. That's a lot easier to quantify, right? So if you can make a correlation between those two things, sometimes it's easier with a third party, shameless plug, then it's much more consistent to get the right buy-in at the right level, which is generally up to like chief of surgery or CNO to make the call that, hey, we have an organizational problem, and at the root of it is our general trays.
Great advice from all those perspectives, guys. If it's, pursuing that quality angle and environmental care, if you see someone walking in your department with a clipboard, that's your opportunity to bring them over and be like, hey, I don't know what you're looking at necessarily, but I'd like to tell you about this. And then also to your point, Kyle, really leveraging that, the money talks and money changes. And if you can connect this to the cost of procedure or cost savings or increased costs if we're not going to be solving the problem. I think those are all winning arguments. Gentlemen, great conversation today. We just scratched the surface of what there is to talk about this topic, and we brought up a lot of other topics that I'd love to dive into, so we'll try to get you back on the show here soon.
Awesome.
It's been a pleasure, Hank and Bob and Kyle. Thank you all for inviting me to do this with you all. It's been a lot of fun, and I thank you for the time.
That was Craig Stevens, IHT Manager in the Pacific Northwest, and Kyle Louie, Senior Strategic Sales Executive at Aesculap. Bobby, I knew this was going to be one of those episodes where we try to fit a lot into a little amount of time. But, man, such terrific takeaways. Got my mind spinning on all of the great opportunity there is out there to show that sterile processing can drive efficiency. I love these kinds of opportunities where we can show off that we can improve the process just like any other department out there and make a huge impact. This was awesome.
Yeah, it definitely was enough to whet the appetite. I think we could run a full conference on this topic around optimization, because anytime you get optimistic about solving a problem, there are no problems solved that don't create other problems. And so how do you maximize the efficiency of solving problems without creating bigger problems? I think everybody can probably relate to that. So important topic, and definitely looking forward to talking to those guys again soon.
If you have any other questions for the guests, we'll put their contact information in the show notes of this show. But wait, we've got a great couple of episodes left in this season of Planet Surgery, so hang with us. And until we talk to you again next week, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.